It says here if it's got a 2+ save, you can bang it in Terminator Armour. I decided to make use of the Leviathan Terminator Sergeant because I didn't want knee pads for reasons. The legs were going to have to be reposed, so that meant doing away with the tactical rock. The upside of this was that I got rid of the tactical rock. And while I was in a destructive state of mind, the Crux Terminatus and Purity Seal details on the legs met their respective makers. If there's anything better than a razor saw for separating a Space Marine from its precious limbs, then I've yet to find it. They've included some new hinge detail on the tassets. I think they're called tassets, the hip armour of the new Leviathan Terminators, and that does make the process a little bit trickier, but if you go slowly and carefully, it's fine, just chop it off. Thankfully, the pose I had in mind didn't involve repositioning the knee joints, which, with these new kits, is a bit more of a thing. Fiberglass pencils like this are great for final cleanup, as was the case with the Imperial Eagle here, but do wear gloves and a mask. The little fiberglass strands break off as you use it, and they're really effective at working their way into your very soul. Anyway, giving the Terminator the old legectomy revealed a void in the casting, which I drilled out and plugged with some styrene rod, before repeating the process with some more sensibly sized holes so I could pin the legs back on. Speaking of which, I'd normally use jewellery wire for this kind of thing because it's malleable enough to allow you to make small adjustments when you're positioning the limbs. For reasons I now don't remember, I use steel paperclip, which doesn't. After regluing the legs in a sort of turning to fire pose, I threw together a quick base to make the model easier to handle and to take the strain off of those precarious hip joints. I thought I should probably check the pose at this stage using the Sergeant's arms to make sure I was still well below shark level, before jumping into the bits box to start the servo harness. The top portion of the Cataphrone Destroyer backpack is remarkably close to the top of the old Techmarine servo harness. And luckily, only the top portion's needed because it's going to be mounted directly to the top of the Terminator armour, because you wouldn't give a Terminator a backpack, would you? It's almost like the Cataphrone kit was designed with this kind of build in mind. Not only does it provide the servo harness, but the servo arms themselves, some Mechanicus logos, and the main parts of the chassis for the Thunderfire Cannon. Oh, you're a good little sprue, aren't you? Yes, you are. Yes, you are. The servo arms needed pinning on for strength, but it also allowed me to leave them unglued. As you can see from the wobbly state of the rest of the model, I really like to avoid gluing things together until I absolutely have to. This allows me to remove parts for better access when working on the model later, and it avoids committing to mistakes that I've yet to even imagine. Over 3 minutes into the video and I've made a Terminator. Let's work on his plasma cutting.
That's not appropriate. That's a Volkite charger.
Alright, calm down. The Volkite weapons have radiator cores on the top and the bottom, just like the Techmarine's plasma cut. Look, I don't have to justify myself to you. You're only in this video as a proxy for the lore nerds.
That seems a little disrespectful.
Alright, you got a point there. Anyway, I assembled the rest of the plasma cutter before moving on to the controller for the Thunderfire Cannon. The Finecast model looks like he's holding some sort of ham radio, and that doesn't really do it for me, so I resorted to the old model making trick of sticking a bunch of greeblies together and hoping for the best. The cables I'm adding later will sell out, I promise. What do you call a kit bash that goes together without any hint of catastrophe? I'm genuinely asking because this is where things started to go wrong. Evidently, there's a reason you'd normally sculpt details like this, but I persevered with the super thin styrene sheet and got lots of footage of my thumbs, so here's the finished shoulder pads. Let's do some cabling. Now, that might look like guitar string, but it's actually a flexible coiled copper wire that I got from Zinj Industries. Guitar string's great for certain applications, but it does have this bizarre property. It's designed not to bend, so if you want flowing smooth curves, it's a pig. I added 2 small rings made from styrene tube onto the power cable of the plasma cutter to emulate some sort of quick release, because nothing annoys me more than sci-fi guns that the wielder can't actually put down. Oh look, there's the other half of that Cataphrone Destroyer backpack. Steal the Mechanicus logo. Past me was smart enough to glue the part to a length of styrene rod to make it easier to hold while cutting. This was slow and tricky work, but it actually turned out alright. After some cleanup, I glued it to the Techmarine's chest and added some more of that flexible copper tubing because nothing says genetically modified future space dude like some cheap conduit. Nearly at the finish line. Just need to patch his groin with some Grilliput. I'm no sculptor, as you're about to see, but I do know that I like working with Grilliput, which is a mixture of green stuff and milliput. The resulting putty is less sticky and less rubbery than straight green stuff, and thanks to the inclusion of the milliput, it can be smoothed with water, and it dries hard enough that you can sand it. Now, I made the fatal mistake of doing this job when I had a train to catch, and the sculpting work on the left hip wasn't quite as clean as I'd like. Obviously, I could go in and clean it up, but it's so much easier to hide it with something. After some final assembly, that's the Terminator Techmarine finished. Let's move on to
I hope you realise that it makes no sense for a Techmarine to be given Terminator Armour.
No, it's probably best not to pull at that thread. I mean, these are toy plastic soldiers. None of it makes sense. Speaking of which, let's make a Thunderfire Cannon. The tracks from the Cataphrone kit look way better than the OG Thunderfire Cannon, but they're too narrow, so I made a new centre chassis section from 1mm styrene sheet. That gaping hole in the front of the chassis wasn't exactly looking great, so I blanked it off with some more styrene before diving into the bits box to find something mechanical looking for the rear. I can't remember exactly where this exhaust piece came from, so if you recognise it, let me know in the comments. Riveting stuff. I'll do the gun. This is brilliant, but I like this. Evidently, I'm now making a Thunderfire Cannon. Anyway, that means lots of different bits of tube, and I think that's best illustrated with pictures rather than words. I generally find myself using Evergreen branded styrene tube for things like gun barrels, because they actually make sizes that telescope inside of each other, which apparently nobody else has thought of. Moving around to the back, the breech, the arse end of the cannon, and the copper tube needs its aperture plugging with some 1mm styrene. The breech detail comprises more small rings of styrene tube capped with discs of 0.5mm styrene sheet, which were cut out with a leather punch. This is a really useful tool and you should buy, 6 of them. To hint at some kind of locking mechanism, I added some 2mm hexagonal section to represent bolts. And I guess that means the Techmarine has to laboriously undo 4 bolts every time he wants to reload the cannon, but that's very much his problem, not mine. Underneath the cannon, the recoil suppression system apes the original Thunderfire Cannon, with the main tubes being made from 3mm hex section, adorned with those Cataphrone weapon parts, some styrene tube and some 1mm rivets. This was secured to the underside of the cannon, followed by an unnecessary rivet montage. Like all good Space Marine vehicles, the Thunderfire has a gun sight, camera, machine spirit googly eyes thing. Mine came from the bits box. I think it was from a Storm Talon gunship. In any case, I pinned it onto the top of the barrel to withstand the rage I felt when I realised the model I'd been slaving over had just been moved to Legends. Back to the gun carriage, stroke chassis, stroke whatever you want to call it. The sides were laboriously cut from 0.75mm sheet before giving it a bit of lumpy beautification. Evidently undeterred by the Techmarine shoulder pad debacle, I made a wrapper for the outside from 0.25mm styrene, and it worked. I don't know what you were worried about, it just worked. Oh, I should mention, if you've taken a leave of your senses and want to build one of these yourself, then there are links to the plans in the description. Anyway, that just about wraps up the main assembly of the chassis. All that was left to do was to install some magnets in the upper and lower chassis parts because we want the gun to be posable, obviously. Oh yeah, the armour. These were cut from 2mm styrene sheet and the middle sections look pretty rough. That's because I was about to sand in a 45-degree angle on each side. These were assembled and then the gaps were filled with sprue goo, which is Tamiya extra thin and in this case offcuts of styrene sheet, so it's not technically sprue goo, but same thing. This leaves a nice solid assembly that can be sanded down to shape. And that pretty much takes us to final assembly. You'll notice I added 1 or 2 details off camera because I can only pretend to be competent in short bursts. I checked with Scully and it turns out Techmarines are still red. So I kicked things off with a coat of German red-brown primer by Vallejo and then threw some black on everything else. As you can see, I still haven't really glued anything together. Foresight or indecision, you be the judge. The main body of the Techmarine got a white zenithal highlight to allow the Mephiston red base coat to cover with full saturation, before moving on to panel line washers. I always use oil washers for this because my hands shake more ferociously than that thing your missus keeps in the bottom drawer. Importantly, both can be cleaned up after the fact. Sorry about that, I could have made myself the target of the joke there, but my wife watches the videos. Nerd. Next up, glowing plasma coils. I'm not a big fan of objective source lighting in general, but I kind of feel like you have to with plasma weapons, though I do prefer to keep it a bit more subtle. Then it was onto the old Sol windows. Jade green for the bulk of the lens, with a little bit of white added for the highlights towards the top, and then a specular highlight made with my improvised dotting tool. Breathe in! The rest of the paint job is, honestly, mind-numbingly repetitive, with copious highlights of Trollslayer Orange and Fire Dragon Bright. I don't want to put you through all of that, so I'm going to rest of the owl this because, well, this isn't a painting channel. If you want to see how I painted the Thunderfire Cannon, I did pretty much exactly that in my last video where I rebuilt the Primaris Invader ATV. All things considered, I quite like my entirely implausible Terminator Techmarine and a wildly unusable Thunderfire Cannon. My aim with any miniature is to create something that makes it uniquely mine, and if possible to confuse and upset the purists. Boxes checked. And with that, I should probably stop talking. I hope you found the video useful or entertaining, and hopefully not too insulting. Please do apologise to your missus for me, yeah?